Right, and good evening once again, boys and girls. And we are now looking at the consequences of a falling birth rate or declining population. What are the serious consequences? What are the bad outcomes which are going to hurt Singapore because our population has been declining? And we first spoke of one of the factors, which is an aging population, and we kind of explained how an aging population negatively affects Singapore, or hurts Singapore, or how it is hurting and will continue to hurt Singapore as our population ages. So you can watch the video again if you want to refresh your memory about that particular factor. But we're going to move very quickly into two other factors which will wrap up the portion on the consequences of a falling birth rate, and make reference therefore to the top of your notes on the type 2 question. I've kind of phrased it a bit differently from what we had for type 2 when we were looking at the principles of governance. But let's examine the type 2 question here, right? So the type 2 question, and of course it's type 2 because as you should already know, alright, but if you still are a little bit unclear, let's refresh your memory. Essentially, it's 10 marks, and we know it's type 2 because there is weighing. Which is the more serious consequence? And there are two consequences here. One is a weak defense force, and the other is unable to attract and retain TNCs and MNCs. Let's talk about TNCs and MNCs. As you see in the notes, TNCs means transnational, right? T stands for trans, the N stands for national, and the C stands for corporation. And you also call them MNCs, multinational corporations. Now, what are some of the TNCs or MNCs? If you were to kind of Google it up, you will probably be able to find MNCs, and you get some names. Very common companies which you probably be familiar with, like Samsung, Apple, right? These are Nike. These are all transnational corporations and multinational corporations, and you will learn a lot about it in globalization in Sec 4. But to very quickly explain to you, a transnational corporation, multinational corporation, basically is a global company. They have offices throughout the world, factories, facilities. They source resources and raw materials and manpower included worldwide. They're always looking for the best quality at the lowest cost. Alright, I say again, the best quality at the lowest cost doesn't mean they look for the cheapest resources or the cheapest manpower, but they look for the best value for money. Right? They can pay a person very high, but the person has to be extremely productive or has a certain very special expertise which is needed by the MNC or the TNC to offer its services or to carry out its production of goods. So in a nutshell, that's what a TNC or MNC is: a global company which hires worldwide and sources for resources and raw materials worldwide and manufactures worldwide as well. So why would a declining population make it difficult for Singapore to retain and attract TNCs and MNCs? We're going to explain that very quickly, and you'll probably understand it jiffy. And of course, why would we have a weak defense force? Now, this is probably easier to explain than this, so just take 2 minutes. Don't even look at the notes if you haven't yet, but if you have, well done. Why would we have a weak defense force? Because we have fewer and fewer young people, and our population is declining. Well, pause maybe 15 seconds, and we'll discuss this. So okay, 15 seconds is up, and essentially you would realize that if you have fewer young people in a population, then the number of people going for national service, which you probably be well aware of, and you know about it having watched Our Boys to Men, you would know that you have to do national service, boys, a couple of years. And so if there were a lot of old people and very few young people, then not many boys are going to be entering national service, and you cannot have 60-year-old men carrying rifles running around trying to defend the country. You possibly could if you had no other choice, but you probably wouldn't want to have a large portion of your defense force at that age. So you want young people, fit people, and generally people are fittest between the ages where you are now, 15, right, moving up towards 18 and 21. So you're going to have a very, shall we say, weak defense force, because there are simply insufficient people to serve national service. That's the first thing. All right, and secondly, even if you had enough people to serve national service, many of these people would be much older. All right, you would end up with a very small, ineffective defense force. And the word in your notes is actually the word deterrent. Right? If you see the word there, there's the word deterrent. Okay, that's the word deterrent. And what does deterrent mean? Basically, if you have a small and weak defense force because there are insufficient young people to serve in it, your potential enemies are not likely to be afraid of you, and so they are more likely to attack you. So when you have a small defense force, basically you are not going to have a defense force that is very much of a deterrent. Okay, so weak defense force, poor deterrence. And of course you have already explained why. I've already explained to you, and you read the notes, you know why. Okay, our defense force will be weak if we have a lot of old people in our population, right? You simply don't have enough young people to serve. So what's going to happen is that if there's a poor deterrent, so likely you're going to be invaded, you're going to be occupied, and Singapore would lose, SG is Singapore, its independence. So you end up with Singapore losing its independence, and you say, well, what's so bad about that? Then in other words, you will be unable, right, Singaporeans unable to determine own future. Well, suddenly you're going to be occupied by another country. You'll probably be kind of enslaved to them, and quite unlikely that they're going to care very much about your needs. Okay, since you are the occupied territory. Okay, so Singaporeans unable to determine own future, you'll lose your independence. I think losing your independence itself is a serious consequence, right? If you don't think that's serious enough, then I have nothing much else to say, right? Because you lose your sovereignty, you lose your citizenship, you lose your rights, right? You lose everything, right? Just as when Singapore was occupied by the Japanese, okay, or when we were colony of the British, essentially we were subjects of the British Empire, we were not citizens. Alright, so it's so much better to be a citizen because you can vote, you can decide your country's leaders and therefore your future. But you can't do that if you are an occupied territory, to put it simply. So that's going to be a negative consequence of a weak defense force, and that comes about because if your population is declining, you have more old people, fewer young people to serve national service or serve in the security forces, and the security forces will be much smaller, and therefore a poor deterrent. Okay, so we're quite clear about this, not too difficult to understand. But the second, or the third, sorry, because this is number 2, weak defense force, the third serious consequence of a declining population or a low birth rate essentially is inability to attract and retain your TNCs or your MNCs, right? Unable to attract. There we have it. Unable to attract, right? Unable to attract and retain TNCs. Now, why? Why wouldn't a global company like Samsung want to come to Singapore if we don't have many young people available to work for them? That's because they would rather, right, employ a young person, young meaning someone below 60 years old, okay, to work for them than someone who's 70 or 80 or 85, okay, and who may have already a lot of physical ailments. And even if they're not, or they're still fit, all right, they could be demanding a pretty high pay if they are well educated and on top of that, they may not have the kind of energy and vigor. I'm not saying this is true for all cases, but I would say it probably wouldn't be a wrong generalization. So they would rather hire a fresh graduate or someone who's worked 10 years, 15 years, enough experience. And these, or they want to have a choice, right? They don't want to just have a large pool of old people in a country. They want to have a mixture of people, and preferably a higher proportion, of younger people. So if you look at the notes itself, it says quite clearly that if there are insufficient young workers as the population gets smaller, foreign companies, TNCs, may not have enough manpower, right? Because they need a broad spectrum of skills, not just in terms of age, but if you've got more young people, they can probably pick and choose who they want to hire. And again, referring to the notes which you have in your possession, TNCs will not want to set up operations in Singapore because existing TNCs may also leave, because if they cannot find the right people to work for them in Singapore, is either we import that talent, which is what we're doing now, bring in foreign talent, or we kind of like allow the TNCs to leave, because TNCs are going to say, look, I can't find the correct people here. I need to go somewhere else where I can find the workforce to help me carry out the services or produce the goods which I need. So as a result of TNCs leaving, now this is where the negative impact comes about. Well, if you're unable to attract and retain TNCs, right, then they will leave. And when they leave, fewer jobs in Singapore. Right, and that's in your notes as well. I'm just going to put it here very quickly for you. You can see it now here, right? When TNCs leave, these are unable to attract and retain TNCs, TNCs will leave. Fewer TNCs will come in the first place, and there are fewer jobs in Singapore. Now, so what? And the golden question is really, so what if there are fewer jobs in Singapore? Why is that a negative impact? So there will be high unemployment, right? So even the young are not going to be able to get jobs. There's going to be high unemployment. Okay, so there's going to be high unemployment, then the standard of living is going to fall. So fewer jobs, okay, high unemployment, or your young people are going to be unemployed, and your standard of living goes down. So ultimately, that would be your ultimate negative impact, isn't it? Right? TNCs and MNCs provide jobs in Singapore. If the TNCs and MNCs leave because they are unable to find enough young people to work for them, because our population is declining, there will be fewer jobs available for those young people who are still around and therefore employable. Therefore, you would have proportionally high unemployment, and because employment provides what? Employment provides income, right? Because jobs equals income, right? Jobs equals income not only for the people, but jobs equals income for the nation as well, isn't it? Jobs equals income for the nation. So if you don't have jobs, essentially the government can't tax you. They can't tax you not just directly, but they can't tax you indirectly, because you basically don't buy anything. So you can't even collect GST from you, can't collect ERP from you, because you don't drive, you don't even have money to buy a car, all right? Maybe you have money to buy a bicycle, all right? So as a result, overall, if the government is collecting less tax, they'll be less able to redistribute that with good public works and good public facilities, and so the standard of living as a nation will fall. At the individual level, right, because you've got less money in the pocket, because you either paid less or you've lost your job because the TNCs have left, as a result, your standard of living for the individual and family will also fall. So that is a clear-cut, serious consequence. Now then, the second paragraph there, if you're unable to attract MNCs and TNCs, is not so direct that individuals who work for the TNCs and MNCs do their jobs. And what about those who work for Singapore companies? Well, many of these local Singapore companies depend on TNCs for business. They're either supporting the TNCs in terms of some services or sub-products or production parts which they could be selling to the TNCs, or services, food and beverage services for people who work in the TNCs. They would require some of such services, right? Telecommunications, laundry, so on and so forth. So there'll be further unemployment. I think the keyword there in the notes, if you see for yourself, is further unemployment, and there'll be great economic slowdown. Now, use this word economic slowdown. And so then the serious effect at the national and individual level would be the standard of living would fall, right? So because of this inability to attract and retain TNCs and MNCs is the third very serious consequence of a declining population or falling birth rate. So to summarize, we have three serious consequences: an aging population, which of course more old people than there are young people, and as a result less tax collected, and also a redistribution of tax collected towards healthcare, therefore less tax available to be used for other national needs, and this could seriously impact Singapore, such as a weaker defence force indirectly, or maybe a poorer quality of education in Singapore. And so this has serious consequences. And the second serious consequence would be weaker defence force, simply because there are fewer young people to serve in the security forces. Security forces are weaker, less of a deterrent as a result. Ultimately, you are less likely to be less likely not to be invaded, therefore more likely to be invaded and occupy and lose your sovereignty and lose your independence. That's pretty serious. Or lose your citizenship as a result of that. And the third serious consequence would be unable to attract and retain TNCs and MNCs, and there's going to be vast major unemployment, right? Because the TNCs and MNCs leave. SMEs, which small and medium enterprises which depend on the TNCs for business, will also be affected, and therefore there will be mass unemployment. Economic slowdown will take place, standard of living will fall, and that's a serious consequence. So to wrap it up, these are the three factors as explained to you, as the serious consequences of a declining population or falling birth rates. Very importantly, which of the three? This particular question, which we wrote out, okay, which is also at the top of your notes, essentially is the inability to attract and retain TNCs and MNCs more serious a consequence than a weaker defence force. And again, we go back to what is weighing. Okay, so in weighing itself, and let's just wrap up this section. In weighing itself, we want to be able to find a common criterion. Okay, so if you have unable to attract and retain TNCs versus weaker defence force, which is more serious? Which is more negative for Singapore? Alright? So which is more serious and which is more negative for Singapore? Let's look for a common criterion. In other words, serious in terms of what? Alright? And I think if you think about it carefully, if we are unable to retain and attract the TNCs and MNCs and create jobs as a result of that, we basically have a very low standard of living. We will not have a strong defense force, even in terms of defense equipment. All right, we cannot hire and retain members of our security forces, right? Even if we conscript everybody. So essentially, the more serious consequence would be the one which creates the resources, right? The more serious consequence is one where, because that occurs, right, the resources available for Singapore goes down. And because the resources, what's available in Singapore goes down, you will end up with a weaker defense force. So you would first need to attract and retain, right, your TNCs, so that you have the money to have a strong defense force, and perhaps supplement the fact that you have fewer young people to serve in it. But the reverse is also true. You can argue that, well, you wouldn't be able to attract and retain TNCs if you had a weaker defense force in the first place, because this is the far more serious consequence, because you end up being invaded, and even if you could attract the TNCs, you will have lost your independence by which time. So you could argue that this therefore is a more serious consequence than this. So it's open. You could argue either way, and whichever way you argue it, if you explain it well enough, alright, it would be accepted, and that would be your 9th and 10th mark for your Type 2 essay. And with that, boys and girls, I wish you a good evening, and do write out your essays, and I'll see you next week.